Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. Recently, Bart Ehrman came out with a new book. If you don't know Bart Ehrman, Ehrman was a Christian for many, many years. He was a fundamentalist Christian and got good theological training. In his master's degree, he started having some doubts because he did a paper on a quote, supposedly from Jesus in Mark's Gospel, where he seems to get the wrong priest. He's referencing something in the Old Testament, priest Abiathar. Anyway, he writes this paper, and a long paper defending how Jesus did not make a mistake and Mark didn't make a mistake and so forth, and all the options. And the professor wrote on the paper, why couldn't have Mark just got it wrong? And that started Bart having a lot of troubles, and he went on and got his PhD at Princeton, and then he studied textual criticism and had more problems because, in his view, if God inspired the text, surely he would make sure that there were never, ever any variants or errors in the copying or transmission of the text, and yet we know there are many, 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 many variants in the text, though almost all of them are completely worthless. They're just grammatical. Nevertheless, for him, there were big problems with that. And then he started doubting his faith, and then he started struggling with suffering, and all kinds of things just got worse and worse. And eventually he left his faith altogether. He calls himself an agnostic atheist, which, I mean, when you define it the way he does, it makes sense to him, but technically the words don't make sense together at all. An atheist has always meant one who believes in the proposition God does not exist. But now atheists have redefined it to mean I don't believe God exists. And then Bart says, well, I'm agnostic too because I'm not sure, but I don't believe it. And certainty has nothing to do with it. That's why that's all confusing. You can be an atheist, you can be a Christian or a theist and not be certain. But that's what he calls himself, and fine, that's whatever. But, of course, he's the favorite darling of non-Christians, atheists, skeptics everywhere, except for Jesus mythicists. They don't like him at all because Bart actually believes Jesus existed. And fundamentalists hate Bart. Fundamentalist atheists, fundamentalist Christians, all Muslims love Bart Ehrman because he attacks the veracity of the New Testament and the Bible in general. So if you like his conclusions, you love Bart Ehrman. If you don't like his conclusions, you usually don't like Bart Ehrman. In scholarship, it's kind of an relationship. His popular level books are not the same as his scholarly level books, and that's fine, except that, in my opinion, very, very often in his popular level books, it sure sells well. If you've listened to my podcast before, you know that what I think about Bart Ehrman. I've never met him. I like his sense of humor. He seems like a nice guy. He does. He's clearly intelligent. I think he's a good author. He's clear, and it's not always easy to write your thoughts clearly, and I think he does a good job of that. Also, in scholarship, you learn most of the things he argues. That is to say, a lot of the things he suggests in textual criticism, biblical studies, and on, it is basic scholarship. And he'll say that oftentimes. He'll say, this is standard. And he's telling the truth when that's the case. It's just when things are not standard, when he goes beyond what is standard, beyond the evidence, or when he makes certain arguments, well, then like anything in scholarship, you go, well, I don't find that persuasive, and I hear what he's saying, but that's not persuasive. Sometimes I think he's just dead wrong. And I'm sure if you read my stuff, you think I'm dead wrong, but that's the way it works. Sometimes I think he's just completely dead wrong. Other times, I just don't find it persuasive, but I hear the point he's making. But a large majority of the time, I agree with him. And that's, I fantasize sometimes if I had a debate with Bart Ehrman, it'd be pretty boring because I would so often go, well, I think that's true. I think that's true. It's just that there are places where we certainly part ways. His most recent book, the one of which I'm most aware, that came out, is called Heaven and Hell. And it's now he's making the rounds on publicity for videos and interviews and so forth, and emphasizing the conclusions of his book. I recently listened to an interview on NPR, in North America, particularly is popular for people who are well older, but those who listen to interviews and whatnot in the news. And the interviewer asks Ehrman a few questions about his book. Now, in all fairness, I've not read his book. I haven't read his book. Frankly, I probably won't read his book because when I heard his interview, I will assume Bart Ehrman is accurately representing his own views in the book. Now, maybe in his book, he does a much better job of arguing his case. Maybe so. But there are things he says in the interview that lets me know that we're going to fundamentally disagree, and I'm going to cover some of those bases in this podcast now of what it is with which I disagree. So you can listen to the NPR interview yourself if you'd like to. You can just do a Google search for NPR, Bart Ehrman, Heaven and Hell, or I think he also just did a recent interview with Michael Sherman, who's a well-known skeptic, and you can listen to that one. That's a longer interview. That's about, I think, an hour and a half. The NPR is about 40 minutes. And instead of clipping and playing, because I'm not sure I could get permission to play it, I'm just going to read some quotes because I'm looking at the transcript, and I'll just respond to some of this with you. My hope in this podcast is not to spend a lot of energy dogging Bart Ehrman and just critiquing him, but rather I do want to disagree with some of his views, but I hope in this podcast also just to help enlighten you. If you've not studied some of these concepts before, the odds are pretty high you haven't, because this is pretty esoteric. And I don't mean that demeaning, vitiating you. I'm just saying that you probably haven't studied it. That's fine. Most people haven't. I thought I would, elucidate some of these issues. Now, what he's going to talk about in heaven and hell, he also talks about death in general and afterlife in general. And this is just a huge topic, and not everything is not clear, because the words used for these concepts, both in Old Testament, New Testament, and an intertestamental period, when Jews spoke about this, they just simply were not consistent. There's no way around it. They just simply weren't consistent. You can look at any scholarship you want, and that's the case. In fact, whenever you read anyone ever who acts like it is completely consistent, they're not doing a very good job. And I've glanced at books in the so-called Christian bookstores about what it would be like in heaven and hell. And I've looked at some of that. I've had relatives who've bought workbooks and they go over Bible studies with them. And I've skimmed through it before, and it's embarrassing. It's just silly. They cite together all kinds of different verses from all over the Bible based on English translations. And I know they're probably trying to do well, trying to make a systematic approach, taking a systematic approach and trying to give some clear answers on these issues, what exactly it will be like. The problem is it's just not persuasive at all. It's just not at all. And Bart and every scholar or whoever studies this is honest when they say, well, it's not completely clear. The problem with Bart says that sometimes, at least in his interview, but my critique right off the bat is a lot of times Ehrman presents it as if it is in fact just one view here and there. And that is frustrating, because that shows me he's either being disingenuous or means he hasn't studied it well enough to know that it's not that simple. Some things are pretty simple, some things in the biblical text, but this is not one of them. And I'm going to bring up a few things to demonstrate my point as we go along. But I'm saying this at first point to say, if you want to learn more about this, I can recommend some books. Send me an email, go to my Facebook page, or even on my Twitter. I try to stay up to date on those things. And send me an email, and I'd be happy to recommend a few books for you, and you can read a lot more from different perspectives. Okay, so the interviewer asked Ehrman this. The interviewer says her last name is Gross, and I'll just... So her name is Gross. She says, one of the theses of your book about the history of heaven and how is that views of heaven and hell don't go back to the earliest stages of Christianity, and they're not in the Old Testament or in Jesus' teaching. They're not? And he laughs, and he says, I know exactly. This is the big surprise of the book. And I paused there, and I thought, no, it's not. That's exactly what I expected. If I didn't read the book, and I haven't, and I won't, but just picked up the title, I thought, I bet you money, Bart's going to say, there is no such thing as heaven and hell. And everyone in the history of Christianity has been mistaken. I just knew that was going to be the conclusion. It wouldn't be a nuance. It wouldn't be some things people have said about it. He would say, he goes all in. And so that's, no surprise at all for Ehrman's book. And immediately I know that's silly, because I can cite tons of verses that demonstrate, yes, there is concepts of heaven and hell in Christianity, certainly in Jesus' teaching. Jesus talks about hell a lot, and I'll talk about that later. But he says, now again, it's not all or nothing. Let me nuance what Ehrman says. He says, this is the big surprise of the book, and it's the one thing people probably wouldn't expect, because, when I was growing up, I just assumed this is the view of Christianity. So this must be what Jesus taught. This is what the Old Testament taught, and in fact, it's not right. Our view that you die and your soul goes to heaven or hell is not found anywhere in the Old Testament, and it's not what Jesus preached. Let me pause there and say, that's partly true. It is partly true. In the Old Testament, there is no concept of soul going to heaven or hell. That's completely true. And he said it's not what Jesus preached. That's kind of true. If he means it's not the chief teaching of Jesus, then that's exactly right. Jesus never, ever once says, here's how you go to heaven. Here's how you stay out of hell. But it's false if the implication is Jesus did not believe a person can go to either one of these states of being. That's patently false. Jesus tells parables about it. So let me go back. He says, I have to show that in my book. He has to show, and that's true. And I lay it out and explain why it's absolutely not the case that Jesus believed you died and your soul went to heaven or hell. Jesus had a completely different understanding that people today don't have. Now, again, I won't debate that part. Maybe in his book he does try to make the case, and maybe he would have to radically reinterpret certain things. So I won't say more about that. And then the interviewer says this. Are there things in the Hebrew Bible that still support the idea of heaven and hell as people came to understand it? Things that you can extract from the Old Testament that might not literally mention heaven and hell, but still support the vision that emerged of it? Ehrman says, I think one of the hardest things for people to get their minds around is that ancient Israelites and then Jews and then Jesus himself and his followers have a very different understanding of what the relationship between what we call body and soul. Our view is that you've got two things going on in human parts. So you have your body, your physical being, and you have your soul, this invisible part of you that lives on after death, that you can separate the two and they can exist. The soul can exist outside of the body. That is not a view that was held by ancient Israelites and then Jews, and it's not even taught in the Old Testament. Let me pause there for a second. That's somewhat true. It's true that most people today think there are two very distinct things called soul and body, and in my experience, most people think the soul is immortal, and that is, and I'm saying I concur with them. That is not biblical. That our soul is immortal. That's not what Jews or Christians believe. They came to believe in a soul. There are Greek words. There are terms for that exact concept, but they're not immortal. They're only given life if God allows that part of us to live. And so, okay, that's in that sense is true. But when he says that, when he's saying he's critiquing the idea the soul can live outside the body, what's true that the Old Testament doesn't have a concept of that. They did believe that some part of you did exist out of the body. Now, I'll come back to that in just a second because I'll give you evidence in the Old Testament. So again, it's just part of the nuance. So it's true that they did not teach a soul lived on. They did teach something of you did live on. Okay. Bart Ehrman continues, in the Old Testament, what we would call the soul is really more like what we would call the breath. When God creates Adam, he creates him out of earth, and then he breathes life into him. The life is in the breath. When the breath leaves the body no longer lives, but the breath doesn't exist. We agree with this. I mean, when you die, you stop breathing. Your breath doesn't go anywhere. And that was the ancient understanding. The ancient Hebrew understanding of the soul is that it didn't go anywhere because it was simply the thing that made the body alive. And so in the Old Testament, there's no idea that your soul goes one place or another because the soul doesn't exist apart from the body. Existence is entirely bodily, and that was the view that Jesus then picked up. And let me pause there and say that's false. See, it's true and false, constant nuance. It's true that let me maybe now start explicating some Old Testament view. It's the last thing why I said it's false is false when he says existence is entirely body. And that was the view that Jesus picked up. That is just false. There are people who argue for, even Old Testament scholars who might argue this from the Old Testament. But the problem is there are multiple verses that just counter that view. And I just don't understand the emphasis that certain scholars try to make on this point, because existence is not entirely bodily. And again, this is a huge topic. But in general, the word for breath is ruach. And when I say God's breath, ruach is also the term we use, the English term, because of the Latin, for ruach is spirit. So spirit and breath are based on the same Hebrew word. And so in your Old Testament, when you read spirit or breath, it's translating the same term. In context, lets you know how to translate that. And so, for example, in Adam in Genesis, God breathes his ruach, his breath, or aka spirit, into Adam. And of course, that's a pun because he comes from Adamah. Adamah in Hebrew means earth. So Adam is like saying his name is dirty or dusty. It's kind of a nickname. It's a pun. His name is Adam because he comes from the earth. So Dusty, Mr. Dirty, God breathes into him. And when he breathes into him, when it gets stuck in his body, it's called nephesh. They have a different Hebrew word for that, nephesh. The nephesh is God's breath stuck in people. There's a different Hebrew term. So some people often, they try to translate that nephesh, technically speaking, as like the living part of the person. When something is alive, it has nephesh, almost like a living spark or something. It's God's living capacity. So when a person dies, they're metaphorically, God takes his breath away from them. He takes the nefesh away, and that's it. So in that sense, it's true. As far as I know from the scholarship I've read and looking myself in the Old Testament, nefesh never lives past death. Nefesh doesn't. Ever. The nefesh never goes back to God or lives in heaven and hell. That is true. So if you call nefesh soul, which is typically translated that way, then that's where people get confused. Because you say, well, it sounds like a person has a soul, and when they die, well, where does the nefesh go? It just ceases, the breath is gone. It's associated with God giving life, and God can take it or give it whenever he wants. It's certainly in the Old Testament. Now, that's true. However, what's not true is the thing he says existence entirely bodily. Because in the Old Testament, they did not believe that once the nefesh leaves, you cease to exist. The reason why we know that is because you can read the Old Testament, and you can also read the ancient context, the ancient cognitive environment. It was widespread belief amongst all Mediterranean culture, from Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, Canaanite. All the evidence that we have suggests that everyone believed in an afterlife. Now, an afterlife means someone keeps existing. Beings continue to exist. All the evidence suggests that. The question is not whether or not there's an afterlife and people exist to some degree. The question is, how do they exist and in what way do they exist and so forth. So stay with me here because this is important. So everybody believed that. If you look at almost any Old Testament scholarship, they did believe it. It's all over the place. And now their beliefs are quite different. So if you go to Egypt, Egyptians believe something a little bit different from the Babylonians and different from the Hebrews and so forth. The Egyptians had a lot more say about it. They had things, the Book of the Dead. These are spells and sayings that help people live on in the afterlife. They have elaborate ceremonies to help people live on, and you had to have the ceremonies just right. The death rituals were crucial to make sure that the dead one was able to pass on to the afterworld appropriately. If you do not have the appropriate burial, then what would happen is the person, and they had different words, the ba and the ra, which are hard to translate. So that in the Egyptian mindset, there were different parts of a person, not just soul and body. You had some like living animated force, another word was spirit, another word might be mind or personality, and you had a body. They had multiple divisions of anthropology, multiple divisions of a person. And when you died, parts of you died, the other parts of you lived on. And you did different things. So, and that's Egyptian. But you had to get the burial just right to make sure your ba and ra lived on appropriately, or else those parts of the person would be acrimonious. They would be wandering spirits that could cause harm, deleterious. The Mediterranean people, the Babylonians, had a similar concept, and we see these similar concepts in amongst the Hebrews. What I mean is, we have similar concepts that burial rituals are imperative. You need to take care of the body at death just right to help the person make it to their afterworldly existence appropriately. Now, one thing that's very different amongst the Egyptians and the Babylonians with the Hebrews is the Hebrews did not have concepts of heaven and hell, or bliss and punishment, where other cultures around them did. So in the ancient world and that region of the world, it was unique among the people groups for which we have evidence that the Hebrews did not have concepts that the gods punish you or reward you. The Hebrews had, all the evidence we have is that the Hebrews said, basically that's false. When everybody dies, they go to Sheol. Everybody. There's no judgment. You cannot go back to the Old Testament and shove upon it New Testament concepts of heaven and hell and God judges the soul. Ancient Jews apparently had no concept of that. 100% of the people who died went to Sheol. Let me take a break real quickly to let you know about something that's very important to me. That is my website, davidpendergrass.com. davidpendergrass.com is a one-stop place to go for blogs I've written, the various essays on relationships and theology and biblical studies and ethics. Also access to all my podcasts, which are free. You can also see information there that I've done through the years, different sermons and all kinds of stuff. davidpendergrass.com. I hope you'll go there today and check it out. Hey, are you on Facebook? I am too. Facebook.com. Look for me there. A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom. Go to Facebook, click like, and you will have instant access and updates every time I put something on Facebook. You'll have it right away. Facebook.com. A Glimpse of the Kingdom. If you're looking for a book that might help you be encouraged and maybe even challenged to understand the rational reasons to believe in Christianity, I want to recommend humbly my book, A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. You can find it on Amazon. It's in paperback and also in Kindle. And you can find it on audiobook as well. I recorded the book myself in my own voice, and you can hear me read the book to you if you like. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. It's, I think, very inexpensive. With all the amount of time I spent in researching and writing it, it's a steal, I tell you what. And A Skeptic Challenges a Christian is a great book to give to people in your life you think are skeptics, or perhaps they're not skeptics, but they're Christians, but they just have questions. They don't know where to go. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian is, I think, a great start for them. And I've got great resources in the book as well for further reading. But check out A Skeptic Challenges a Christian today. In Sheol, the problem with that concept is there is no analogy for Sheol anywhere in the ancient world. No one had a concept like that. So the only way we understand what Sheol was to them is by looking at every single time Sheol appears in the Old Testament. Well, some scholars think Sheol is simply the grave, just where they go down the grave. But most scholars, I think it's safe to say most scholars think it's not just that, but the Sheol is the realm of the dead. And Sheol can be used metaphorically described as the grave. But there's probably a bleed over in both. Some people thought grave and Sheol probably were a bit synonymous, and other times they use Sheol to mean the realm of the dead. And they would say things like being gathered together with your ancestors. And that's what almost everybody thought. Everyone thought when you died you went to be with kinfolk. You related with people. But Hebrews believe that Sheol is a place where everyone went, regardless of if they were good or bad, whether they were Jew or Gentile. You went to Sheol, and it was a place where you were weak. You barely existed. You might use the translation of the word shade. Jews believed in ghosts. There were Hebrew words for ghost. And you lived in this place. Sheol wasn't miserable. It just was an unfortunate place because you no longer go to the temple and praise God. Sheol could be used as a negative term, particularly in the Psalms, when the assumption is a person might die prematurely. So when they say, save me from Sheol, I don't want to go there right now. It's a way of saying, I don't want to die prematurely. I don't want to die early. So don't let my enemies kill me. And we could look at many, many, many translations, references to Sheol. Oftentimes it's translated the pit, which can be, again, Sheol as well. So they very much believed in Sheol. They had words for ghosts. They also had words for the dead spirits. And I want to go to a couple places where this is the case. And you can look up every reference you want. And so, for example, Ripaim. Ripaim means dead spirit or ghost. And we see this in several texts. And I'm going to read something today just to prove the point. And I'm still going back to address Bart Ehrman's point that, bodily existence is all there is. That's just demonstrably false. Isaiah 14:9, Isaiah 26:14, and Isaiah 26:19. It's in Psalm 88:11, and then Proverbs 2:18, Proverbs 9:18, Proverbs 21:16, and Job 26:5. And so let's look at a couple. So Isaiah, we'll start in Isaiah just for fun. Isaiah 14. Well, I'm going to start in verse 9, Isaiah 14:9. Here's the first reference in the prophets for the particular word. And so here's the NET translation. In 14:9 it says, Sheol, which that's the realm we just talked about. So that's the proper name of the subterranean. It's beneath, way beneath the earth. It was where dead people lie. And I'll say later on, I think I will, in Psalm 88:11, we'll see, or in Job, but it's beneath the waters. And I'll talk about that in a second, because again, their understanding of how the universe works is very different from our own. But Isaiah 14:9, you can read it for your own translation. Sheol below is stirred up about you, ready to meet you when you arrive. Now, I probably should have given the context, but in the context, Isaiah is referencing a Babylonian king. And these verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he's obviously referencing some kind of ancient mythology of a minor god that tries to take over the mountains and falls down to the deep. What scholars cannot be convinced of is which mythology is he referencing. And there's all kinds of arguments for it based on the Hebrew of the ancient world, but we just don't know. So Isaiah, he's alluding to some kind of ancient mythology that ancient people would have understood to make the point that the ruler of Babylon is going down. He's going down, and God's going to make sure he goes down. He's going to make sure. So that's what's going on in the context. Okay, back to verse 9. Sheol below is stirred up about you, ready to meet you when you arrive. So he's saying, this dude, you're going to die. Listen, it rouses the spirits of the dead for you, all the former leaders of the earth. It makes all the former kings of the nations rise from their thrones. So it rouses the spirits of the dead. The term in Ra'im in Hebrew, is that what that means? So the dead ones, spirits of the dead. Again, Bart Ehrman, if bodily existence is all that counts, then what are these things? Why is there a separate Hebrew term for it? And then verse 10, Isaiah 14:10. All of them respond to you, saying, you too have become weak like us. You have become just like us. And that's back to what I said a second ago. That is, the ancient view is that, particularly Hebrews, that these ghosts, these dead ones, they're weak. They're not evil. They don't have the life. They don't have God's life in them to give them vigor. Okay, verse 11. Your splendor has been brought down to Sheol, as well as the sound of your stringed instruments. You lie on a bed of maggots with a blanket of worms over you. That makes a phenomenal praise song. No one's written it yet, but they need to write a praise song about lying on a bed of maggots. Bon Jovi tried to write this, but he ended up writing a bed of roses, and it's a very different biblical text. But if you don't know your Bon Jovi, bless your heart. In any case, the point is the maggots and worms, because that's Sheol's place where they're dead. That's the grave analogy. Look in verse 12, and this is where people get confused about Satan. Verse 12, 14:12. Look how you have fallen from the sky, O shining one, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the ground, O conqueror of the nations. And he goes on for a while. That 14:12 is where we get the word Lucifer. Now in Hebrew, it's Hillel ben Shakar, which means Hillel, son of Shakar. We're not exactly sure, but Shakar probably means Venus or the crescent moon. It means son of the Venus, son of the crescent moon. But these verses, again, 12 to 15, based on some mythology, we just don't know. Well, in Latin, it's lux fedes. Lux means light, light bearer, bearer of light, which probably references to Venus, probably. Well, when Augustine and others saw that in Latin, they thought lux fede was a proper name. Lux fede Lucifer. Lux fede Lucifer. And so they go, oh, someone who fell down, this you have been cut down to the ground, O conqueror of the nations, fallen from the sky, that must be Satan. That is not at all what Isaiah is talking about. This is not a Lucifer. This is not Satan falling from anything. Augustine and people who understood their Latin, the idea that Satan fell from the heavens does not come from the Bible. It does not come from the Bible. It comes from certain Jewish texts that allude to that, like in 1 Enoch, the life of Adam and Eve, and so forth. But they do not come from the Bible. They come from extra-biblical sources that certain Jews wrote mythologies. And they read this and thought, oh, someone fell from the sky, it must be Satan, or Lucifer must be his nickname. It does not. It does not. This is not about Lucifer. This is about the king of Babylon, the judgment upon the king of Babylon. So, okay, well, if we skip down to verse 14, we see the same, in chapter 26:14, we see the same thing. Give me 1 second. And 14, we see, Isaiah 26:14, the dead do not come back to life, the spirits of the dead do not rise. And he goes on, because you've judged them. We see in Psalm 88:11, the same term. Technically it's in verse 10 when it comes to English translation, but in Hebrew, it's a verse off in the Hebrew. That's a long story why, but it is the point. So in the English translation in Psalm 88:10, do you accomplish amazing things for the dead? Do the departed spirits or dead spirits rise up and give you thanks? Again, the Rephaim, the dead spirits. We have 3 in Proverbs. Let me go to Job 26, verse 5. Now, Job, of all the biblical books, speaks the most about ancient cosmology. That is their view, what we would call the universe. They don't have a concept of universe, but all of reality. Job speaks the most of it, more than any other biblical book. There's more references to how the world works or what it's like in Job than anywhere. So it's interesting to find out, but it's a good window into how ancient people, ancient Hebrews particularly, saw the world. And I've talked about that in other podcasts. But in any case, so here in Job 26, and this is where Job is talking about God's greatness and is huge, and he sees all things and knows all things. He says in 26:5, the dead, or the dead ones, that's the same word, the dead spirits, Hadaphim, the shades, tremble, those beneath the waters and all that live in them. They're beneath the waters. They almost certainly what Job has in mind is, because of other references, the idea is that beneath the earth are huge bodies of water, or the chaos, and above what we call sky are bodies of water. And that's all the way back to Genesis, that God divides, he pushes back the water, we might say pushes it up and pushes it down, and then dry land emerges. But there's water below us because that's what causes flooding, and there's water above because that's what causes rain. And the idea is that beneath those cosmic waters, beneath all that, is where the dead live. And then in verse 26:6, he says, the underworld, or Sheol, the Sheol is naked before God. That is, God sees all Sheol. The place of destruction lies uncovered, and he goes on for a while back there. Well, I could go on for a long time about cosmology. Well, I will a little bit, but it's just very, very different. For example, in verse 26:11, the pillars of the heavens tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. The pillars of the heavens. And most scholars think he means either literal pillars that we just don't see, or it's a metaphor to the mountains, because it's very likely the case ancient people thought the mountains held up the firmament, that the sky was hard and it sat on top of the mountains. They acted as pillars. And I go on for a long time, but all that to say, that's what they believe. So these Rephaim are referenced in the Bible. Here's several references I just gave, that some part of the person, it's a different word, it's not nefesh, it's not soul, but some part of the person, in fact, does live on, does exist in the afterlife. Okay, I'm going to bring it to a close right there, and what I want you to, please listen to part 2, and that'll come real soon, okay? We'll pick back up with Bart Ehrman and his article. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King. And I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.